If you haven't noticed, there has been one Line Rider release from 2020 that has had a major influence on the tracks that were made in 2021. Def Tab's Everyone Asked About You, Vivabel Harvey's As Difficult, Branch's Something Just Like This, OTDE's Live Like a Baby, Ethan Lee's A Fleeting Life,
also Mount Eerie, which just released,
as well as my own tracks, Bells and My Boy, all take major inspiration from a single track. And that track is Visible's Freaks. Maybe you don't understand why people like and are inspired by this track so much. You look at the 2020 Top 10 and ask yourself, how did this end up in second place? Or perhaps this track resonates with you, but you can't quite put your finger on why. Or also, maybe, you just love this track and want to hear me gush about it. No matter how you feel about Freaks, I want you to hold on to that feeling and ask yourself, why do I feel this way? Not, what do I like or dislike about the track? I want you to reflect on the sources of your emotions. And if you haven't watched Freaks, what are you doing here? Go watch it. Go have an emotion about it. And come back so we can talk. I'm Ava Hoffman, and this is Line Rider In Depth. When you watched Freaks, and you did go watch Freaks, right? Maybe you noticed a few things about it. If you're familiar with Line Rider, it's pretty clear that the art really isn't all that pretty or quote-unquote good on a technical level. If you were an internet weirdo who doesn't understand what the word objective means, maybe you'd call it objectively bad. And the movement isn't anything to write home about either. By all accounts, it looks and feels like a track made by some random kid. Bosch is bouncing around in a barely synced fashion, the art seems crudely drawn, and there's even an overly long off-sled section at the end. So what's going on here? Why do I, and so many other people, love this track so much? I want to start to pick this question apart with a book that has meant a lot to me. So much so that it's essentially informed the entirety of my approach to making things for the past 2 years. Lynda Barry's What It Is a beautiful collaged comic book about making art, either with words or images or sounds. And I think what Barry says about the artistic process is invaluable to understanding why I find myself so drawn to Freaks. Much of What It Is devoted to thinking about what, exactly, creativity is. That's the it in the title. Barry rarely answers these questions directly, but chooses instead to tell us about her creative journey, and asks us open-ended questions about the strange little mythologies and play rituals that existed in our own childhoods, and even in our present-day minds. Especially of interest to her is the creativity of children, and how that creativity might disappear when those children begin to grow up. I want to ask you, what art did you make as a little kid? Did you draw? Did you write? Did you sing? Did you dance? Did you play little games or put on make-believe performances? Do you still do all those things you used to do? For those things you've stopped doing, why did you stop? Something that Barry keenly dissects in her book is that, socially speaking, art begins to mean something different from the things we make as children.
The word art started to mean something new, something we had to learn about and feel dumb because of, or smart because of. Most people felt bad at art and never drew again. By the 6th grade, I stopped doing ordinary things in front of people. It had been ordinary to sing. Kids are singing all the time when they are little. But then something happens.
And this is perhaps an important starting point. Although Visible is not in grade school, their track invokes a mindset from this period of time, wherein we're aware of one kind of creation, the open-ended creation of children, while being confronted with art as something you can be good or bad at, as a kind of discipline which corrals creativity into certain predefined modes. In fact, Freaks takes place explicitly in that disciplining environment. A core narrative element of the track is that it is taking place in the notebook of a narrator-like character whose thoughts and perspective we learn through navigating the track itself. Throughout Freaks, we see doodles and inspirational quotes interspersed with math problems you might find in a journal buried somewhere in a middle schooler's backpack. We are continually made aware of the social forces which are acting on this character, the rigid definitions of a school learning environment, the bullies and crush with which the narrator interacts, and their own internal creativity and love of art and music being used as a shield against the negative experiences these other social systems have forced upon them. the influence, in fact, of the Doodle Notebook track itself. And the word doodle is key here. Crucially, Lynda Barry identifies the doodle as
one of the last places drawing still exists in a person who gave up on art long ago.
The doodle is a place where our childhood understanding of making art is able to live on. Doodles are a place where one line can still follow another without plan. What does the doodle offer us, and what does Visible's track invoke by inhabiting the space of the doodle? I want to suggest to you that the space of the doodle is the essence of creativity and creation. Barry identifies several crucial things about when we used to draw as children.
When I was little, I noticed that making lines on paper gave me a certain floating feeling. It made me feel like I was both there and not there. The lines made a picture, and the picture made a story.
The doodle is open-ended creation. In some sense, it is letting the drawing draw itself. And in Freaks, we can see the way in which Visible engages directly with doodling and allows the process of making Freaks to be one of surprise, discovery, and unplanned stories. In fact, I actually asked Visible about the way in which they made Freaks, and they told me that they made Freaks with no planning whatsoever. They just had the idea that a rock song about being misunderstood would fit in the notebook of a misunderstood teenager nicely, and started scribbling. Yet, despite being unplanned, these scribbles are able to communicate so deeply the headspace of the character who created them, create their own, oftentimes surprising stories. For example, in one moment the character writes, "There's more behind this," next to a pair of glasses that have been taped together. On one hand, it ties into the narrative about this character being nerdy and bullied. The narrator saying, "I'm more than just my surface appearance." But it also becomes a statement about the track itself, and how the surface of the doodle or scribble contains within it all the depth of the human stories we tell ourselves. And then, near the end, we see those glasses again, but the tape is gone. Our narrator character has gotten new glasses. There's also this great bit with these math problems where the narrator character struggles with trying to answer them. However, the character correctly answers the final problem after slowly getting better at solving them, creating this really great arc which fits neatly with the broader emotional arc of the track. And wow, that arc. Because Visible allows each doodle to flow into the next, letting each idea feed off of the last, the track naturally becomes incredibly well-paced, swelling and ebbing with the emotional changes of the music. This is part of how seamlessly and expertly Visible is able to go from a nervous IDK and a sad balloon to a landscape of smiling scenery, peace signs, and inspirational quotes. Visible is able to follow the impulses of what they, and the character they created, are feeling, to let the drawings and the story they make guide Visible in a dialogue with their own art-making process. Line Rider and its history have a very special relationship with doodles and the people who make them. If you talk to almost anyone who played Line Rider during its mid-2000s heyday, but didn't get extremely into it, unlike, let's see here, anyone in this community or on this channel, they remember Line Rider as the weird toy they doodled a silly little track in, maybe with some basic and crude drawings, where Bosch eventually crashes at the end. And if you even do look at well-known tracks from that period, like One-Eyed Giant or Jagged Peak Adventure, what do they look like? How do they function? They're little doodled scenes or stories. Who was, and who still is, the largest proportion of people opening up Line Rider and drawing something in it? Little children doodling away. And Line Rider, as this place which has so often held the doodles of people who otherwise have given up on making art, frequently brings in a community of people whose only artistic medium may be Line Rider. Line Rider has this opportunity to be a really nurturing space for people who think they are bad at art. And I think these are some of the histories and experiences that Freaks is able to touch on so powerfully. Many people who have played Line Rider have also doodled in their notebooks, or in Line Rider itself, trying to make the boring hours of school pass more quickly. And in that doodling, they find themselves transported by the art and stories they've sketched away in the margins of their pages, searching for ways to navigate and understand this world they've been placed into. I mean, there's a Line Rider artist named Doodle Chaos, for fuck's sake, right? I'm not stretching here. Doodle Chaos. This resonance between the form of Line Rider and Freaks' content is a key part of the influence of Freaks in the present, nearly a year and a half later. Before this moment, there were plenty of tracks where Bosch was a character in the narrative. However, depicting the mindset of a character making the doodles of Freaks seems to have been a wholly original move on Visible's part. It's an incredibly layered feat, actually. Freaks follows where the doodles lead, and in the process is able to convey information both about the narrator character of the track and about Visible themselves. In effect, it creates a track which feels both like a well-constructed narrative and a deeply lyrical and reflective piece about Visible's own mindset, emotions, and experiences. Visible told me that Freaks was made at a time where they felt very misunderstood and nostalgic about middle school teenage life, and those emotions are absolutely apparent throughout Freaks. But gross! This is all touchy-feeling subjective stuff. Maybe you're one of those people who looks at a painting in a gallery and gets mad that an infant could make it. In that case, Freaks seems specifically engineered to irritate that part of your brain, maybe this instinct you have, where you want to sort everything in terms of technical ability or objective measures of craftspersonship. And if you're the kind of person who has that kind of instinct, or even if you're not, I want you to step back a little bit, and I want you to return to the art you used to make as a kid that you don't make anymore. What is that process by which many of us lose our capacity to make art? What is it that scares so many people off of making art at all? Barry identifies 2 questions which rob us of our ability to create in a childlike way. Is this good? Does it suck? Why is it that so often these are the only 2 questions we have about the things we make? Barry identifies something crucial about how the 2 questions come about in terms of our relationship with our audience. Barry notes that when she drew good art,
they liked me more after I drew that picture.
But that also the inverse was true for bad art.
It turns out there are also drawings that can make people dislike you. Drawings that make people think you are dirty or stupid or lame. One by one, most kids I knew quit drawing and never drew again. It left behind too much evidence.
As artists and audiences, we are so often trapped by the 2 questions in ways that keep us from actually accessing creativity or accessing an honest interaction with the creations of others. You know that instinct I was talking about that makes you upset when a piece of art is simplistic or ugly or objectively bad? Have you considered where those instincts come from? The ways in which this goodness-driven perspective has been socially foisted upon you? When you feel upset that people love a piece of art that looks like a 5-year-old made it, is there some part of resentment directed towards the ways in which your 5-year-old creativity was stymied, squashed by a disciplinary art rubric of good and bad? If we actually take on that charge, that anyone could make a piece of art like that, then perhaps instead of starting from a position that amateur-seeming art is not valuable, we can start from the position that anyone with any kind of technical ability is able to make valuable art. How does that radically reframe the ways we understand good and bad? And how does that undermine the systems of value which cordon off art making from so many people, a system which directly benefits financially from these notions of good and bad art? What if we stopped asking the 2 questions and turned towards real questions about what a piece of art is? Things like what it means, who is the person that made it, the manner in which it was made, and how we, individuals, have an encounter with that work. As Line Rider began to grow up, a similar thing happened to it as well. The community that formed around this little doodle tool began to ask each other, and themselves, is this good? Does it suck? And through this, a series of standards, of disciplinary conventions, began to take root. This channel has already discussed this process extensively in other videos, such as the gamification of an art medium video. But Line Rider began to slowly drift away from scribbly scenery and having fun making Bosch do cool tricks to formalized quirk communities and attempts to dethrone one another with the quality and line count of their scenery. This is a point that is still relevant today, even as the days of hardcore quirk communities have begun to wane, and the Line Rider community has increasingly gravitated towards artistic expression as their main focus. In a very real way, the perspectives positioned on this channel and within the Line Rider artist community have become the mainstream position of many people who make things within Line Rider. These are no longer the days of that gamification of an art medium essay, once described as existing in the present. As the community increasingly adopts the perspective that Line Rider is an art medium, we must still ask ourselves, Are the things that we as artists may establish as conventions drifting away from the essence of creativity and towards socially enforced notions of good and bad? Are there people who could be making things in LineWriter who are driven away from the medium because they feel bad at making art in LineWriter? How can we build and sustain creative spaces that allow us to access those feelings at the heart of how we made things as children? This is a point that Bevabel Harvey explores and struggles with extensively in the previous In Depth, an incredible 2-hour-long video essay about Toivo's I Can't Ride These Lines Without You. Bevabel offers us so much valuable perspective on what it means to make art, but in truth, there are some points in their essay that I disagree with them on. Bevabel talks about the inescapable of the desire to be seen through their art, the need for validation from an audience or an artistic community. Bevabel's solution at the end of their essay is to find a community that will appreciate and validate the things you make. Their essay expertly identifies the two questions. Is this good? Does it suck? But views them as unassailable, inescapable. Their solution, essentially, gives up the ground the two questions take. They suggest we should find social systems and communities that will validate our need to have the two questions answered, to find a disciplinary standard that fits our own pathologies around social acceptance. Barry tells us that she kept drawing because she figured out how to make the good kind. But what was the result of this devotion to good writing?
For the next 30 years, I chased after only good drawing. While I drew, my main feelings were doubt and worry, and when I finished, my only feelings were relief and regret. I never drew for fun anymore, and I'd forgotten about that feeling making lines on paper used to give me. I'd forgotten how stories used to bubble up out of the lines and surprise me. It was why I started drawing, to meet those lines and stories.
In Bevabel's video essay, the idea that someone could enjoy making art in LineWriter, that the lines and stories within LineWriter could bubble up from the browser window to meet us and surprise us, is conceptually impossible. I think maybe as a product of the ways in which the history of LineWriter has been one of a demand to make good tracks that don't suck, LineWriter, as a social community which has this history of demanding people to make good tracks, has limited people's capacity to imagine a way of making art that isn't filled with doubt and worry and regret and relief, just like how Lynda Barry felt for all those years. And all of this is part of how Freaks has been so beloved and influential in this respect. It gives us a vision of this kind of art making which has been buried for many long years in the LineWriter community. Freaks gives us permission to let us make art in LineWriter in the way that we want to make it, to set aside the two questions and just scribble. When I talked to Visible, they told me that making Freaks was like a fight between the logical part of their brain and the emotional one. In the end, for Visible, the emotional part of their brain won. Freaks is an artifact of and represents this rejection of the so-called logic of art as a discipline, of educational forces which have acted upon us in a myriad of negative ways, of the two questions. I say all this as someone who has experienced this directly through Freaks. For years, I had kept my eyes on the LineWriter community from afar, religiously watching the top 10 and its tracks each year it came out. I desperately wished that maybe I, too, could make art in LineWriter. But each year, I looked at the top 10s and said to myself, there's no way I could ever do something like that. I felt certain that I wasn't good enough at drawing, wasn't good enough at getting Bosch to move the way I wanted her to, wasn't good enough at syncing music. And I felt absolutely certain that I'd never be able to get good enough to do anything up to the top 10 standards, even as I deeply felt each year that LineWriter could be doing so much more than anything even in the top 10. And those feelings were deeply tied to everything we've been talking about throughout this essay. Before I could even read or write, I wanted to be a visual artist. But as I began to grow up, I found that I could never make an image look good in the way people said good images looked. For various reasons, I didn't have the dexterity or fine motor control to produce so-called technically competent images. Once I learned to read and write, though, I found out that I was good at those things, according to my parents and teachers. And so I abandoned visual art entirely for writing. But I think I absolutely held onto some kind of kernel of regret when I stopped doing visual art, and my feelings of being unable to be technically competent at LineWriter on any level were tapping into that regret. So when I saw Visible's Freaks at number 2 and 2020's Line Writer Top 10, something opened up for me. Here was someone disproving the things I told myself to convince me to never even try. Here was someone using doodles and writing to tell a story in Line Writer. Here was the painting a 5-year-old could do, hung in a gallery, and it was kind of a revelation for me. I could make art in Line Writer that had value. In fact, anyone could. You could, if you tried. You and I could tell a story using this art medium. And this is true for any art medium. Music, painting, dance, writing. All of these things you and I did as a child and gave up on just because we weren't good at them. Soon after that, I made the first track I ever released, Lipstick Stains. It's not the most amazing piece of art in the world, but I made it in a way that let me follow my own scribbling. And when I started scribbling and making art in Line Writer, new questions and problems and ideas kept presenting themselves. If you watch my tracks in order, I think you can really clearly see how each track gave me questions I tried to answer in the next one. And I found this process to be deeply gratifying until I was making things that, I have to admit, are pretty good. Things that I'm proud of making. I'm obviously not free from worrying whether people will like me or my art on some level, but that's for those times I'm not making the art, like after I finished a piece. But I try to always access that childhood place of creation, the kind of deeply serious fun that making art meaningful to me requires. In one crucial sequence, Lynda Barry depicts herself struggling with the two questions. She asks herself,
"What's missing from my work? Technical ability, story structure, action poses. I give up. I don't know. I don't know."
And that was the answer. Not knowing. Not knowing the answer to the questions. Not knowing exactly what it is your work is doing.
The solution was always the same. Give up. Make useless pictures. Waste time and materials. Have no purpose.
And this not knowing or giving up is not the same thing as intentionally making garbage or pretending you think your work is bad in order to deflect criticism. It is genuinely, seriously not knowing. It is using that not knowing as a space for childlike creation. Kids waste materials, make useless pictures, and have no purpose all the time. But in so doing, they learn things, and in the learning, they let the things they make guide them into new and personal worlds. This is what Freaks does, and it encourages us to do the same. Next time you're making art, or thinking about doing some kind of new creative thing, and you start worrying, is this good? Or does it suck? I want you to think about Freaks. And I want you to admit that you don't know, and to let that not knowing take you into new spaces of thought and creation. Open yourself up to childlike art making, just like Visible did in Freaks. Because when I get that way and start worrying about my art, thinking about Freaks helps me. And that's why Freaks is incredible, and deserves for us to ask things other than those questions which can so totally stranglehold so much of what is valuable about being alive and experiencing the art, people, and places around us.
Hello, it's me, Rabbit Squirrel. That was not me. If you couldn't tell, that wasn't me. That was Ava Hoffman, who is now the third person to have written one of these Line Writer in-depth pieces. Ava's been making Line Writer tracks for a little over a year now, and she's been really pushing the boundaries of what can be done and what we should be doing, and it's all very exciting. Please go check out her channel. Particularly, I think, recently I would recommend I Wanna Be Well and My Pal Foot, though there's content warnings for both of those, so read those first. So, like, subscribe, the bell. I don't use the bell. Do people use the bell? I don't know. I don't know what it does. But hit it, I guess. Find out what it does. That sounds like fun. This channel has a Ko-fi if you want to support us doing this stuff. If you wanted to go to Ava, just like say, you want to support me, I have a Patreon, but I won't plug that here. I guess I just did. Whatever, it's fine. Thanks to Banky, formerly OTDE, There's been a name change. They are now It's Banky. So thanks to Banky for the voiceovers. Also, that's a cool book, isn't it? It's called What It Is. I recommend it. It's even got some like exercises where you can like do writing stuff, so check that out if you want. What It Is by Linda Berry. Get it from your local bookstore. I use a site called IndieBound, and it like tells me local bookstores in my area that like have books. The next video is probably, hopefully, gonna be something from a new person, from yet another new guest writer. We'll see. I'm very excited that we're gonna be launching a podcast soon. Those will be uploaded here, and they'll also be in like podcast places. Ava's doing like interviews with people about cool Line Rider tracks they made. It's gonna be great. We've already got one in the works right now. It is an interview with Jade, aka the channel Branches. It's about Mount Erie, which everyone should go watch that. But that's going to be the first episode of this podcast when it drops. The podcast is called Outside the Lines, so look out for that. Visible, who made Freaks, has made more things. Freaks was, believe it or not, their first Line Rider track, but they've made more things after that. You should check out Cold Death if you're up for some really heavy, dark stuff, and also check out, what's it called? True Love, which is their most recent track. And I think that's it. I think that's everything. Thanks for watching this video. See you sometime soon. Goodbye!